You are now listening to 1-900 Old Ladies, The Lost Art of Making Lefse, written by Ellie Starr, narrated by the author. Post-production by Pinto Media. Chapter 23. Then you pick up your special lefse stick and scoop up your bread under the middle. Flip it onto the griddle and cook until it starts to bubble like a pancake. Just a few seconds. Then you pick it up the same way, under the middle with your stick, and flip it over. See? Some brown spots? But it's not cooked so long that it's crispy. Yeah, that's it. Perfectly cooked. Sigrid Sievertson. Ellie Sievertson stood solemnly cuddling her young grandson in the kitchen of her North Dakota farmhouse. She had just learned, minutes before, that her elderly husband had been discovered dead in her old barn. His lifeless corpse had probably been preserved in her barn most of the winter, frozen into one very large Stanley popsicle and buried under a heap of his rusty tools and equipment. Ellen was certainly moved by the news of her husband's death, but she had come to accept the fact that Stanley was advanced in years. He was 21 years older than she. In addition, he was an alcoholic who had cheated death on many occasions during his lifetime. There was no question in anyone's mind that Stanley would soon meet his maker. The real question was, how would he ultimately kick the can? Her older sister had finally broken the sad news to her. Both Marge and Ellie's son had discovered Stanley's decomposing body in the barn almost 2 weeks ago, while they cleaned the barn to prepare for an auction. Ellie was overcome by guilt in the knowledge that her closest sister and her only son were the unfortunate ones to have come across Stanley's remains. How horrible it must have been for Stan Jr. to see his father dead in such a fashion. Stan had always been a devoted son to Stanley. The curious thing about Margie's revelation to Ellen was that Stanley's passing seemed like news to Ellen. Margie was sure that Ellen not only knew that Stanley lay dead in the barn, but she was 99% positive that Ellen was the one who had killed Stanley. Not that Margie blamed Ellen for ever being driven to murder her crotchety spouse. What terrified Marge more was her younger sister's surprised response to the news. She concluded that Ellie had most certainly blotted the entire episode from her already fading memory. Ellen sat soberly hugging her young grandson at the kitchen table. She expected to be greeted by her young daughter-in-law, Rosa, when she entered the farmhouse. But Rosa seemed to be indisposed at the moment. Ellie thought she detected the faint sounds of Rosa vomiting in the nearby bathroom. Just then, Margie's 900 number rang. Ellen looked around and called for Rosa. The cordless phone rang several times. She started to panic. What'll I do? I don't know how to answer Margie's line. Maybe I'll just answer as Elsa Dietrich and tell them to call back later. She picked up the phone and stammered, 1-900 hot mama? This is Elsa Dietrich speaking. Can you call back later? She asked. The caller was undeterred. It was Jack, Marge's habitual caller. He was looking for the old Gabrielle. Oh, yeah, Jack. I'm sorry. She's not here right now. If you call back in another 20 minutes, you can speak to the other Gabrielle, she assured him. Jack seemed desperate. Ellie could tell that he had been crying. He needed to speak to the other Gabrielle, the older one, the girl in the ad. He told Ellie that only that Gabrielle knew him and understood him. If only he knew her real name. If only he could find out where she lived. If only he could speak to her and see her, he could confide in her his most intimate secrets. She would understand. Ellie sympathized with the caller. Oh my gosh, you sound so darn unhappy. I really feel for you. No, she added decisively. I can't give that kind of information out. He pleaded ever more desperately with Ellen for some shred of information about Margie. He was at the end of his rope. He had lost his job. They were about to shut his phone off. He could no longer afford to keep calling, and his own mother was about to kick him out of her house. He just needed someone to talk to. Well, you can talk to me if you'd like, Ellie volunteered. I just found out that my poor husband has died. I know what you're going through, hon. I'd be glad to listen. Jack sobbed frantically. He asserted that, although Ellie seemed nice, he needed to talk to the other Gabrielle. Only she understood his innermost thoughts and feelings. As he continued to explain the futility of his current life situation, Ellen suddenly recalled her conversation with Margie about the doctor who had been calling on the 900 line. Well, I know that she said she had someone calling for her on this line. I guess it won't hurt to tell you a little more about her. Yeah, okay, but you have to promise not to tell a living soul about this. She's my sister, Margie Carter. We live up here in Himmel, North Dakota. The caller seemed surprised. Margie had him convinced all along that she lived in sunny Florida. Oh, no, hon. She hasn't lived there since last summer when the hurricane blew everything away. She lives up here with me on the farm. Her husband, John, died late last year, and we're up here all alone. This number's the only thing we have to sustain ourselves. Nope, there aren't any men around to care for us now. We're all by ourselves, just me and Margie. Ellen seemed a little aloof as she spoke about being alone with no man to protect her. In truth, Stanley had never been there to protect her. But Jack didn't need to know that. Jack was relieved that Ellie had given him this vital information about Margie's identity and whereabouts. He thanked her for the information. You're welcome, Jack. If you're ever in North Dakota, come see us any time, Ellie stated. Oh, and you can always call here. Just give her a few more days, and I'm sure she'll be back to take your call. Bye, hon. Ellen hung up the phone. Rosa entered the room as Ellen hung up the phone. Hi, Mom, she greeted, as she excitedly grabbed little Robert from his grandmother's arms. Ellen kissed her daughter-in-law on the cheek. Hi, hun. I had to answer Marge's line because you weren't here, Ellie stated. I haven't been feeling very well lately, Rosa admitted. Yeah, I see that, Ellen grinned shrewdly. Morning sickness, eh? Ellen had keenly perceived Rosa's current predicament. It seemed her recent activity, answering the 900 line, had not only enhanced Rosa's sex life, it boosted her apparent fertility. Don't tell Stan. He might be upset. I'll just have to figure out how to gently break the news to him. Ellie bounced excitedly. Oh, I'm going to be a grandma again. She kissed her daughter-in-law once more. I'm so happy for you, hon. Please don't say anything, Mom. I have to figure out the right time to tell Stan. Ellie crossed her heart and placed her finger over her mouth. My lips are sealed, dear. Who was on the phone just now? Rosa inquired. Oh, nobody, hon. Just someone calling for Margie, she replied matter-of-factly. She joyfully turned her attention to her young grandson. Oh, little Robert, you're going to have a little brother or sister soon. Aren't you excited? John Jacob Harvey rested his mother's phone receiver back into its cradle. His cheeks were wet with tears. He had borne his soul to a strange woman on the 900 line while he sat on his mother's plastic-covered sofa. He wore a white t-shirt and white pair of painter's jeans. Both his jeans and t-shirt were coated with dried spatters of various shades of interior house paint. He wore a pair of worn work boots. John Jacob lived with his mother in her clean but modest Pineville, North Carolina home. He was 35 years old and single. He had a very strong, rural, deep South accent. He had struggled to find regular work his entire life. This was due mostly to the fact that he wasn't very bright, he wasn't very skilled, and he had never been very dependable. He had a curious receding hairline and a bald spot, which extended around the back of his head in a horseshoe pattern. This left a small tuft of dark brown hair just over his frontal lobe. In a mistaken effort to preserve his youthful appearance, he kept this tuft of hair uncut. It hung down in front of his forehead, where he combed it into a wicked point. He possessed dark brown, almost soulless eyes and sunken cheekbones, which made him appear gaunt. In rare moments, John Jacob would grin, revealing his oversized incisors and his 50-cent grin. That is to say, he had a sufficiently large enough gap between his two front teeth that one could squeeze 2 quarters side by side into the space. His body frame was small and wiry. During his childhood, he was very self-conscious of his small stature. As a result, he constantly bullied weaker students at least 2 grades younger than he. John Jacob was a regular caller to the sex chat line 1-900 Hot Mama. He had racked up a bill of over $3,000, which neither he nor his mother could afford to pay. His mother was retired, and he was now jobless, so the phone company had since threatened to cut off their phone service. Only his mother called him John Jacob. His few friends and the rest of his estranged family called him Jack. His mother had threatened to kick him out of her house if she ever found out that he had been calling Marge's number. Jack waited until his mother left the house before secretly making his calls. But it was simply a matter of time before the next phone bill arrived or the phone was shut off completely. He had scratched down Marge's name, along with the name of the town where she lived, onto a memo pad which sat next to the phone. He tore off the top sheet, folded it, and stuffed it in his jeans pocket. His mother was a short, stocky woman of 5'3". She was sufficiently overweight and suffered from arthritis, which meant that she hobbled everywhere she went. As a result, she wore naturalizers with knee-high pantyhose for more comfortable walking. Even though she always wore long skirts, the rolled-down tops of her pantyhose were still visible under her skirt hem. She had long gray hair, which she kept tied up in a French twist. If it were not for the sour expression which was permanently carved on her old, wrinkled face, one might have perceived her as a wrinkled old grandma. But she, in fact, had no grandchildren. John Jacob was her only son. Jack's mother walked through the front door, returning home with a big bag of groceries. She was livid. "Did you call that number again?" She set down her bag of groceries. As she peeled each food item out of her paper bag, she droned on about John Jacob's uselessness, his laziness, his selfishness, and the exorbitantly large phone bill he had racked up in recent months. "Is this the way I raised you?" she continued with her back to her son. "I can't believe y'all are this irresponsible. What the hell is wrong with you that you can't get off on your dead ass and get a goddamn job?" She was furious. "I want you out of here for nightfall, you hear me? And don't you dare try to talk me into letting you stay, you sorry son of a bitch." It really hadn't dawned on John Jacob's mother that by calling him a son of a bitch, she was indirectly insulting herself. A better insult might have been to simply call him a bastard. Although he was legitimate, his mother never really wanted him to begin with. After her husband walked out on them when John Jacob was 9, she blamed her son for her estranged husband's departure. In fact, from the time he was a small child, John Jacob's mother believed all her miseries were attributable to John Jacob. It hadn't always been like that. When he was a toddler, he tried to be good, but it seemed as though when he was good, he was almost transparent. He soon discovered that he could gain more attention, albeit bad attention, by misbehaving. As he grew older, the nature of his transgression grew more severe. So severe, only a few unlucky dead people and God himself knew the truth about his crimes. Eventually, John Jacob's deviousness became a part of his self-fulfilling prophecy. He realized that his mother derived her own sense of self-worth by belittling her son. Consequently, he decided early on that he would give her as many reasons as he could to blame him for all her woes. In a twisted way, he was being the good son by being willing to be the bad son. But Jack was now 35, jobless, and completely unfulfilled. Aside from his dysfunctional relationship with his mother, the only romantic relationships he could carry on were at strip clubs and with women who answered his numerous 900 calls. Even then, these women were paid to talk to him. When they ridiculed him for being unemployed, impotent, and living with his mother, they were essentially treating him just like his mother treated him. He decided that he had been the whipping boy long enough. He had been the subject of mockery for every woman whose life he had ever touched. He no longer wished to be ridiculed, and he was tired of shouldering the blame for his mother's misfortunes and her failed marriage. John Jacob quietly unplugged both ends of the long, coiled phone cable. He blankly studied his hands as he wrapped each end of the cord through his palms several times. He turned to his mother, who still had her back to him while she stocked the kitchen pantry. As she continued her speech regarding her son's numerous inadequacies, he snuck up behind her with a telephone cord wound around his hands. Mrs. Harvey's final diatribe was not the usual critical put-down of her inadequate son. Her last speech was the subtle sounds of barely audible gasps as her frustrated and humiliated son choked the life out of her. It was over in just moments. He stood over his dead mother and relished the deafening silence. He attained an almost blissful state of tranquility as he kneeled over his mother's corpse. He quizzically cocked his head and waited for her to open her eyes. Realizing that she would not wake from her slumber, he frowned and shrugged his shoulders. During his entire exchange with his mother and his subsequent murder of her, John Jacob Harvey uttered not a single word. He eventually rose and calmly stepped over the lifeless body of Mrs. Harvey. He snatched the green duffel bag, which he had previously packed, and he immediately moved out of his mother's home. After all, that was what his mother had asked John Jacob to do all along. Paul Baker rested at the edge of his bed as he readied himself for sleep. His wife, Doris, rummaged through the box of books she had previously purchased at Stanley Peters' estate auction. She studied each of the titles as she stood in her floor-length nightgown. She loved to read anything she could get her hands on, and she had incorporated reading books into her bedtime ritual. Now what do I want to read? She asked herself, glancing into the box. I think I want something that looks well read. I guess if somebody else liked it enough to read it, I should find it interesting too. She picked up a Harlequin romance novel. Maybe this. She read the synopsis on the back of the book, then placed it back into the box. Nah, I'm not in the mood for that. She glanced over at her husband. Paul looks like he needs some rest. She chuckled to herself and studied the contents of the box a bit more. Then she noticed a particularly worn copy of The Pale Horse by Agatha Christie. Yes, this'll do. She repeated the title aloud as she examined the cover. A compelling mystery by Agatha Christie. That rhymes. She joked to herself as she fluffed up her pillow and nestled herself under the covers on her side of their queen-sized bed. Paul also wriggled himself under the comforter on his side of the bed. He switched off his bed lamp and kissed Doris goodnight. He turned on his side facing his wife as she sat upright reading. He closed his eyes and drifted off into peaceful oblivion. Doris grunted, bewildered. She studied the pages of the book in her hands, scanning each one. She tapped her drowsy husband on the shoulder. Paul, are you awake? He sleepily opened one eye. What is it? Something very curious about this book, Paul. What's that? He asked. This book is underlined, like someone has studied it. Every occurrence of the word thallium is underlined. All references to the symptoms of thallium poisoning are underlined, like fever and hair falling out by the roots. She opened the inside back cover, pointing to it. And here, Paul, someone has scrawled something. What does it say? Paul inquired, now fully awake and interested. It says, Yum yum rat vittles lutefish kills a Norway rat. Yum yum rat vittles? That old-timey rat poison? Paul asked. Yeah, my dad used to use that stuff for rats in the barn. You know, before they took it off the market 20 years ago, Doris answered. Lutefish? What do you think that is? Maybe they mean lutefisk. Perhaps whoever wrote this wasn't a Norwegian, Doris suggested. Paul sat upright on his side of the queen-sized bed. Doris handed him the book as he examined the pages. You know what I think, Paul? Doris inquired of her husband. Paul nodded affirmingly to his wife. I know what you're thinking, Doris. Looks to me like someone tried to use this book less for entertainment and more as a recipe for murder.